Hello, welcome to Trauma Talks. My name is Russ Tellup. I am your host. Today we are talking to Nat Jovanovic. Nat is a trauma therapist and the owner of Bright Horizons Therapies.com. Let me correct that. It's Bright Horizon Therapies.com. She is also the host of Trauma Demystified, a podcast all about trauma. She works in EMDR, parts work, polyvagal, systemic constellation, man, you name it, and she's into it. So let's get right into it, and we'll see you guys after. Thanks. Welcome to Trauma Talks. My name is Russ. I'm the host. Today we have Nat Jovanovic. Am I spelling it or am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's Jovanovic, but it's okay.
Jovanovic. Okay, cool. She is the owner of Bright Horizons Therapies, and she is a trauma therapist. And Nat, why don't you tell us your story, kind of how you got into the space, and take it away.
Sure. Like I became a trauma therapist mainly due to my own recovery journey from childhood abuse. I have experienced all forms of childhood abuse. So I started a very intense healing journey when I was in my mid 30s. And so at this stage in my life, I was living in Spain. So I'm originally German Croatian and I now live in Canada. So I really went into like, how can I heal from it and how can I become healthy? I think my main motivation was how can I create healthy relationships? And like I had symptoms like self-injury. It was really like when the conflict got too intense, I would dissociate.
Mm-hmm.
So there were many elements where I was fairly functional, and there were elements where I really had all the symptoms of trauma, like a dysregulated nervous system. Like my nervous system tended to go far more in hypoarousal, and it's still my preferred state. So on my healing journey, I really learned the different tools, and I was lucky enough at one stage to really find trauma-focused professionals, and this was in Spain. Like I was always skeptical about therapy, mainly because in my family, it was really stigmatized, like you're crazy if you go to therapy. And also on the other hand, there were parts of me that really didn't believe that healing was possible. And I had no framework how might healing look like. So because I was so used to different forms of abuse, so that it was hard to imagine how does a healthy work look like. And so this kind of influenced me, and it took a while for me until I had the courage to start my healing. And I had a couple of therapists who were really pathologizing, and it didn't work for me. And at one stage, I found those who were really helpful, who were aware how to navigate their power and also not pathologizing my symptoms, but really also seeing my strength and helping me to find healthier, adjusted skills to go through conflict.
Sure. Now, when you say there was some stigma around therapy, was that, you said you were German descent?
Yes.
Was that a cultural thing, or was that more just within your family?
I don't know. I think to some degree, I think it's still cultural. I would say even here in Canada, there are certain cultural aspects. In my own experience at this stage, this was more my family. So like there was a lot of stigma around it. And my parents, they both lived through the Second World War. So they had their own history of trauma that they didn't look at. So there was like things going on that at this stage I didn't fully understand. But my primarily influence was my family. And I assume their own fear to look at what has happened to them.
Right. And you grew up in Spain, or you grew up in Germany and then moved to Spain later?
I grew up in Germany. My father has Croatian roots. My mother was fully German. My family dynamics were really complicated. Like my parents separated, but they were really united in hatred. My mother was discriminative against my father. And he was violent with her. So my father had really violent behavior. My mother was more on submissive, not doing anything. And she later remarried. And my stepfather was physically violent, mainly with my sibling. But for me, it was a constant threat of physical violence. And so my coping skill was to freeze. My sibling's coping skill was to go into a fight response. I think, like to some degree, I think it was helpful for me to freeze because there was less trouble. But later on in life, it got really complicated because learning to stand up and be assertive was a journey.
Sure. So when you were going through your different healing modalities, as you were kind of tackling these things, what did you find helped you most?
I did a lot of the combination of parts work therapy, like within somatic approach. Like when I speak from parts work therapy, it always needs to integrate the body.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked with a modality which is called systemic constellation in Spain. I now can see elements of IFS. Now that I learned about IFS, I can see that there are similarities and differences. So constellation work goes really deep down into your body, and it's system like you can work with these dynamics and really process the emotions. Then I did a lot of things around coaching. I found coaching helpful because it was less pathologizing than traditional talk therapy.
Yeah.
So things like assertiveness, my values, setting healthy boundaries, I really got it from a more coaching style. Though I also need to say, coaching for me was a lot of around doing parts work. And so I think for me, mainly it was parts work, working with my emotions, but also skill building. How can I be assertive? How can I be in my body when somebody is in conflict with me?
Okay. How long ago did you start your healing journey?
How if I look back now? Let me check. I think probably about 18 years ago.
Okay. And how long have you been coaching and a therapist yourself?
Um, 11 years ago. Like I now do this
Oh,
type of work since 11 years.
okay. So that's a great segue because it sounds like you do quite a bit of stuff. EMDR, parts work, polyvagal. Can you speak to some of the different modalities that you've learned over the course of the last 10 years or so and what you value from each?
Yes. Okay, here's the thing. I think we need to be mindful that working with trauma is a bit different than generic talk therapy. So the first phase of trauma treatment is stabilization and inner safety. And so depending on the modality, so I find in this stage parts work therapy and polyvagal approach really useful because people need to learn on recognize the states of the nervous system and find tools on how they can go back into their window of tolerance. And I find that parts work and putting out the different parts can really help us to connect with our inner self. And so when we go through trauma, what can happen is that we feel more fragmented in different parts. So I was really fragmented. And so for me, the concept of parts made a lot of sense. And
Sure.
so being able to talk to parts is now what I do with clients in the stabilization and safety phase. And it's really, to some degree, it may also look at the relationships in their lives. What is the level of health in their relationships? Like, for example, we don't do intense trauma work in general if somebody's right now in an unsafe situation because bringing all that up wouldn't be safe for them.
Right.
So first step is really, I would say, working with the nervous system, working with the connection with one's body, but also start to connect with one's inner parts and understand oneself better and understand when maybe one goes into a trauma response, but also understand what might be coping skills to work with that. And then, like I use EMDR in a trauma-informed model, so it really aligns a lot with parts work because you need to have a preparation phase. But I mainly use the eye movement part of EMDR to integrate traumatic experiences. And in this stage, the individual needs to have a certain degree of awareness of the state of the nervous system and the capacity to go back into their window of tolerance if they dysregulate. So, for example, if somebody has experienced an accident, it might be far quicker to work with EMDR if they have already the capacity to be in their window of tolerance. If
Mhm.
somebody has a lot of symptoms of dissociations, we first need to work with the parts that dissociate and understand them better before we can move forward into memory integration with EMDR. I also use EMDR and parts work combined, so we can work with a part that has intense emotions. We don't need to go to the past. Does this make
Okay,
sense?
so you will access the part and then do EMDR with the part.
Yes.
Oh, okay. That's very
Well,
interesting.
yes, so it may not fully resolve all the impact of the memory, but it may in the moment give a lot of relief for the part so that the part can release anger, that the part can release sadness. However, we can only do it if the client is in dual awareness. So they need to be connected in their body and in the present moment to be
Right.
able to look at the part and work with it.
So for those, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people listening that aren't familiar with parts work or EMDR, could you just at a high level explain what EMDR is, how that works, and then how it relates to the parts work piece?
Yes. Okay. EMDR is known for the bilateral eye movements to integrate traumatic memories. So in the end, we would work with the memory directly. I think what is not very often talked about, even EMDR has a preparation phase. And so this is a bit like where I think parts work and EMDR connects. And so in an EMDR session, I would ask a client, like we would have a list of the worst things that happened to them, and we would then start working with their memories. We would install them, like we would install the memory and the negative, the beliefs they have learned about themselves. Would look for a positive belief. And then we would really allow the person the space to integrate the memory, go through their body sensations while we do the different EMDR sets. So an EMDR set is that the client focus on the memory and what comes up for them, and I move my fingers and they follow my fingers with their eyes.
Right.
And so there is no right or wrong way to do it. And I think sometimes clients get a bit scared because whatever shows up is right, what needs to show up for them in the moment.
Right.
However, it's really very individual. And then like we would work with that until the emotional intensity is zero. And then we would install the positive belief, and then we would just do a final body scan to see whether everything is integrated. And
So you're
so
doing a little bit of neuro-linguistic programming in there as well.
like, but this
Installing.
is the standard EMDR process, yes. Like in
Yeah.
EMDR, you always have in a final phase where you install the positive belief on the memory that has happened to the individual. Like, for example, if I've learned I'm unlovable, like the belief needs to resonate with the client, but like I could install a belief like I'm lovable, I'm worthy, I'm okay as I am.
Mm-hmm.
Like personally, and maybe that's easy. Like I used a lot of EMDR to work on experiences of systemic violence. And so the belief that came up for me was just like, I'm okay as I am. And that gave me a lot of freedom to just do my own, like live my own life.
Now you mentioned systemic constellation.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain a little bit what that means?
Yes, systemic constellation is something that was introduced by a German person who's called Bert Hellinger. It is a little bit of a combination between parts work. It's based on some pseudo practices. So what you can do systemic constellation and individual counseling with just the person. So it's a bit like externalize the different parts and go into the position of the different parts and feel how it feels in your body. And you can do systemic constellation in a huge group setting where you use representative to represent different aspects of your family, different aspects of your inner world. And so a lot of what comes up in systemic constellation is related to inner child's work. So when I did my systemic constellation, we also did a lot of inner child work.
Okay. Okay. And it sounds like all of this kind of ties into polyvagal theory as well.
Yes.
Can
Like
you?
it is all about how to create safety and connection. A lot of, I think, of about recovery, which is part of parts work, which is part of EMDR, is also using our imagination to really create more safety, to really create also positive pictures. Because if you have experienced trauma, our mind tends to go to worst case scenarios and those worst case pictures. And so we can retrain us on how can we maybe give us a break and for a couple of seconds look at a positive picture. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I'm just going to try to recap. So when it comes to parts work, essentially what we're talking about is when someone experiences a trauma, whether that be a childhood trauma or an accident, like you say, there's a fragment, right? The true
Yeah.
self becomes fragmented, and then we have an exile wound that is over here that you're trying to protect your true self from, and that's where these parts come in as firefighters
Yeah.
and protector parts.
Yes. Like I think when trauma happens, what happens is that we may disconnect from our core self and then the parts take over. So in general, we
Mm-hmm.
have protective parts and we have wounded parts. And what often happens is that we put the wounded parts or the exiles in IFS behind a wall. And so they stay there, and we have these very rational parts that just want to move forward with life and just cope with life, and they want to avoid the trauma.
Right.
And so part of healing really is on how can we create a relationship with all of the different parts, because we cannot be our true self if parts are exiles. And then over time, it's also like, how can we reestablish the connection with the core self so that the self can have a relationship with the parts? hope this makes sense.
Yeah. And then, and another big part of it is that no matter what those parts are doing, there is no such thing as a bad part, right? They're all parts of us. They're all trying to do a job, and they're doing the best they can with what they have, right?
Yes, like I sometimes tell clients because they may have parts that go into a fight response. So they may have behavior that is socially not accepted. And so I say clients like, can you please like remove the intention of the part from their behavior? Because the intention of the part is to protect the clients from something that is a boundary violation, from something that is a really huge conflict. And so this really helps us to have a more gentle or compassionate view on the part and really understanding what was the intention of the part and having a conversation with the part, like what can we do differently or how can I protect you better? Like if I have an angry part, the question is, okay, what do you want to tell me? What boundaries violated for you and how can I take care of this boundary?
Yeah, kind of almost relieving them of the duty that they've been holding
Yeah,
down for so long, right?
yeah.
And then when you work EMDR in there, essentially you've got bilateral eye movement. So you're moving eyes back and forth, accessing traumatic memories, and then time stamping those memories, right? So that the mind can realize that they're in the past and no longer a threat.
Yes, okay. And it's time stamping, but I think it helps us to release the emotions that are stuck in our body. So if trauma happens, some emotions are unprocessed and stuck in our body. And so with EMDR, a person can really process the emotions that they weren't able to express in the moment. However, it may also help them to just see their timeline. So they may see, for example, some clients have experienced sexual abuse when they were young, but they also see how has it impacted throughout their lifetime, and they can make more sense out of their story. So it's not necessarily only working with the one specific memory. It's more like the memory and the impact it had on them on their lifetime.
Mm-hmm. I was doing. I got to be careful of how I describe this because it was with a client. I won't obviously say their name, but I was working with a client who had a protector part that was addicted to sugar. It was this part that was just needed constant sugar. So when we were talking to this person, she identified this part as a dark figure, a figure that was kind of maleficent, kind of negative and kind of frightening and scary. And essentially all we did was she identified the part, she thanked the part for all the work that they had been doing, and then asked the part if they knew how old she was.
Mm-hmm.
And the part said yes, and then asked if they would mind if they took over. And
Mm-hmm.
and when they did that, the part stepped back, and then her her inner child was there, and
Mm-hmm.
she got to interact with her little self and her inner child. And it was one of the most impactful, most powerful coaching sessions I've ever witnessed. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Like it is amazing. And it like I find parts work very effective. And also I think it is a very respectful way to work with our past, but also very respectful because in the end, the client has the power. Like for me, if there is a part that is protective, it's really how can we talk to it and find a way that it steps down, but really respect their concerns, respect what comes up, and respect their pacing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those majorly transformational modalities that if you guys have ever considered working in parts work, it is something else. Now you've got quite a bit of experience in polyvagal theory and somatic coaching as well. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, okay. I use it a lot to explain people on how trauma affects our autonomic nervous system. So in polyvagal theory, it's like a ladder.
Mm-hmm.
So we are either in the state of safety and connection, or we are in the state of mobilization, which is fight and flight, or we are in the state of immobilization, where we are in freeze, fawn, or fault. And so the thing, what we need to understand is if there is a cue of danger, we first go into fight and flight. And if we can't sustain it, we go into immobilization. And every person is different. So we may have very different responses.
Mm-hmm.
What's important to understand, we need to, if we go the ladder down, we also need to go it up. So I
Yeah.
often say to my clients, if you are in immobilization, you need a little bit of fight and flight to get out of it,
Right.
because otherwise it's hard to get out of it. And so sometimes I'm really also noticing that those extreme fight parts that are often very much judged, they help the client to get out of immobilization. And
Yeah.
so I use this model to create awareness within the client about their state. So I really guide them through an experience where they can notice, oh, this is how it feels in me. Oh, this is how this one feels in me. And then safety and connection, oh, they now know how it feels in their bodies. And this helps us to just recognize the different parts. Like I see the different states then again as parts so that we can work with them. But first, a person needs to recognize in their body what state they're in. Otherwise, we can't work with it. And so it is usually when I work with polyvagal informed therapy, it's more like creating awareness about the state, but then also finding practices on how can they get back to safety and connection. And I'm aware that people have experienced complex trauma. Safety and connection may be a state that is hardly ever accessible. So really, how can we increase the experiences of safety and connection?
Yeah, one of the things I do with clients when we're doing kind of our discovery, when we're getting to know each other and getting to know ourselves, frankly, right, is I'll have them do a nervous system mapping. So they'll sit down and they'll start writing out what triggers will trigger them into a fight or flight, what triggers will trigger them even further down into a freeze mode or freeze state. And then with some positive psychology education, we kind of go through all that stuff and we really get to know our nervous system a lot better. And when you know how those states feel, it makes things make sense a lot more, and you're able to be a lot more compassionate with yourself, I think, too. When when you're stuck in that freeze state, you can't get off the couch. And every time you want to go work out, you freak out because the last thing you want to do is get that sympathetic energy up because it just doesn't feel safe. But one of the parts of that mapping is they'll identify based on a percentage how much of their life they're spending in each of those states. And the first time that I did it, I was blown away because I was like 60% of the time in freeze, like 30% of the time in fight flight, and like 10% of the time in a safe, connected space. And it's amazing how much time we don't spend safe, connected, and present.
No, I agree. Like I was very much in immobilized state for a long, long time, and safety and connection was hardly ever accessible. And so it is a journey to get there. Like I really want also invite people to have patience with it. I think if we understand what state we are in, it's less crazy making, because I think immobilization can feel so crazy making because nothing
Mm-hmm.
seemed to happen. But like now I just normalize to myself, okay, just a state. And honestly, the last thing I want to do is to move, but I also know the most effective thing for myself to get out of it is dancing. So it's
Dancing?
really, yeah,
Are
pushing me
you a
out.
dancer?
I'm not a dancer. I'm very awkward. It
Okay.
just put music and
So you
dance.
just enjoy dancing.
Yes, I enjoy it. I'm not. I'm really awkward. Like, but on the other hand, I know it's really so good to get me out of immobilization.
Yeah.
And I really like, and then it's when I push me gently. Okay, you know what's best for you. You know you don't want to do it, but just like motivate yourself to do a bit of it.
Well, being polyvagal informed, I'm sure that you're aware of how humming or vibrations in the throat can really pull you into that connected space. I'm the lead singer of a band. So that's one of the benefits for me is every time I'm rehearsing and practicing, I am toning my vagal nerve, right? Every time I'm doing that. So music is a huge, huge outlet for me and definitely keeps me connected and present. So, do you have any go-to polyvagal kind of exercises that you do with your clients to help them move through these different states?
I have certain exercises where we really create a list of what are activities that bring you back to safety and connection? What are people who bring you back to safety and connection? What are places that bring you back there, and what are memories? So I sometimes use EMDR to install those memories that bring people back to safety and connection so that they can really fully connect with them.
Mm-hmm.
Like I use a lot around like also memories that brought you resilience that can help you to go back to safety and connection. And so you can use the eye movement also to increase the intensity of these positive memories. So I often use this in polyvagal theory
Yeah. Yeah.
exercises.
Um, when you're working with a client from, let's say, start to finish, and obviously it's different for everybody, but how long is your typical time that you're spending with a client? Like hour-long sessions?
Oh, yes, like my sessions are normally like 60 minutes long, 55 to 60 minutes. It may depend on what we do, also what's going on for the client. So I have some clients who have experienced complex trauma where we may spend maybe 20 minutes for more intense work, but then also a little bit of time for more gentle work with them, like really finding the right balance, like how much of the time can we use for more intense work and how much do we maybe use also to organize daily living. And for some clients, it's easy to have 60 minutes and do the intense work. So I like there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's really
Sure.
about how it can be adjusted to the needs of the client.
Yeah. Do you typically work with clients for long periods of time, multiple sessions, obviously, but I mean, do you find that you're working with clients for like years and years and years, or is this something where they're seeing benefits pretty quickly?
Okay, here's the thing. It really depends on what has happened to the client. Since trauma comes in a lot of intensity, like I sometimes work with clients who have the idea. I work with clients who have really profound, severe trauma lists. So with these clients, it may be a year-long process. Like it may be longer, like 2 years, 3 years, or even longer. It
Right.
may also depend, like if a client in the present is in a situation where they are not fully safe, it's really difficult to start doing the trauma
Yeah.
work. You may just do the work on how can we get you in a safer situation. I have, for example, a client who had experienced a very toxic workplace and trauma due to a very toxic workplace. We had a process that was about 5 months. So we did stabilization and then we did the EMDR and then it was resolved. And they later on told me also they met the person who had perpetuated the abuse towards them and they didn't have any emotional response at all. And it was really easy for them to be around them and they never imagined that it would ever be possible.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and that's something else to point out is trauma. I mean, a lot of people when they think of trauma or childhood trauma, they're thinking of, trauma from their parents, but that could be trauma from school, trauma from religion, trauma from other family members, trauma from people who aren't part of your family. And then obviously there's trauma as adults too, right? Traumatic toxic relationships, work environments, all kinds of different things and you mentioned complex trauma a couple of times, some like complex PTSD. Could you talk about what complex PTSD versus just PTSD is?
Yeah, I give a high level overview. And I'm also like, for me, complex trauma, like the diagnosis of PTSD is a little bit different than complex trauma, like just because diagnosing means you fit in the diagnostic criteria. For
Right.
me, complex trauma has usually an additional complexity because it is related to relational trauma, or developmental trauma. So to somebody you trusted in betrayed you very deeply. So it can
Mm-hmm.
be domestic violence, it can be childhood abuse, it can be like, toxic workplaces. And so it is usually there is a parts of us that really lost trust in our relationships that may also lost a more global trust on, in humanity in a way. And so I think for me, there is just the aspect we need to work with attachment and we need to also be really mindful and respect those parts where the boundaries have been so extremely violated. And so, yeah, like for me, complex trauma always means we have a different level of severity just because we have the impact of society on us. Like complex trauma can happen also when people live through war because there are
Mm-hmm.
just so many layers on how we are affected by it.
Yeah, and something else to note is trauma. You hear a lot about big T, little t. In my opinion, there is no big T, little t. Trauma is trauma is trauma. It's
I agree.
whether your trauma is from a car accident or going to war, it's still trauma.
Yes, and we need to be mindful, like we have trauma due to events and we have trauma due to enduring conditions. And I think enduring conditions erode us more over time. Like emotional abuse may not be as identifiable as sexual abuse,
Mm-hmm.
where it just erodes our sense of safety and our trust in humanity over time. And we are living in a traumatic environment. So, and this is a bit like complex trauma is usually if we are part of a traumatic environment or violent environment.
Yeah, I grew up in a pretty violent home. My father was pretty violent. and other family members that were pretty violent and abusive. So I can definitely relate to the complexity of emotional and physical and sexual, and I mean just about every type of abuse you can think of, and it just piles on and piles on and piles on and adds a lot of different layers.
Yeah. Like the one thing I want to say, like trauma means that it overwhelms our capacity to integrate the emotional experience. And so it can happen. And this is a bit big T and small t. So trauma is really what has happened to you and how has it affected you. And it doesn't matter what the event, it is really about like how you experienced it.
Yeah, the somatic experience, right? And your inability to cope with the somatic experience, and it kind of leaves that imprint
On us.
on your body, yeah, and on your nervous system.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nat, if they wanted to work with you, how would they reach you to work with you? Do you have a website?
Sure. I have a website, which is brighthorizontherapies.com. So they can reach me through my website. They can also email me at nat@brighthorizontherapies.com. If they're interested in, I have a podcast, which is called Trauma Demystified, where I share more of my insights about trauma. I give some psychoeducation. I also give some tools that I hope help people to do their recovery.
Awesome. And I'll include those in the show notes so people can check that out. And you said it's trauma demystified?
Yes.
Awesome. Would you mind after the show sending me an email with some links to that so I can include them in the show notes? That way people can reach you and check out that podcast.
Sure.
Cool. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience? Anything else that pops out in your head?
What pops out in my head, I know that it's sometimes really difficult to believe that healing is possible when people have experienced trauma. The one thing I say, it is a journey, but I also believe it's possible. So I would really invite people to look at themselves and find some support that can help them to do that.
Yeah, I would agree. And you know, if you go to one person and you just don't feel it, don't give up. Try someone else. You know, I am living proof that it can change your life, and it is possible. If you met me 2 years ago, you'd be like, "What in the world is wrong with this guy?" Yeah. So it's definitely possible. It's critical. The world we live in, there's trauma around every corner, and we're just about all dealing with trauma at some point, at some level. So yeah, I would definitely agree. Get out there and do what you can to heal.
I agree. Like I believe for myself, my recovery was worth it.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, my quality of life today compared to 2 years ago is night and day. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on, Nat. I really appreciate it. Not Nat Jovanovic. Jovanovic or Jovanic?
Jovanovic.
Jovanovic. Okay. So it's very nice to meet you. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise. If you want to check out Nat, you can go to brighthorizontherapies.com or check out her podcast, Trauma Demystified. And we'll put links to both of those in the show notes. And then her email address is just nat@brighthorizontherapies.com. And I'm sure she's got plenty of information on her website that you guys can go check out and get some more information on her and the different things that she's doing in the trauma space. So thanks again for coming on, Nat. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Russ. I appreciated our conversation.
My pleasure. We'll talk soon. Thank you. Guys, once again, if you're interested in working with Nat, you can check her out at brighthorizontherapies.com or on her podcast, Trauma Demystified, or you can email her at nat@brighthorizontherapies.com. And Nat, that's Bright Horizon with no S, correct?
Let me check that. Bright Horizon Therapies, yes, without an S.
Okay, so brighthorizontherapies.com, nat@brighthorizontherapies.com. Thanks again, Nat. Really appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Enjoyed that as much as I did. Nat is brilliant when it comes to trauma and how it affects us on a daily basis. And if you guys are interested in working with Nat, you can check her out at brighthorizontherapies.com. If you guys are interested in working with me, you can reach out to me on brainspottingcs.com, or you can just go to Facebook, send me a message there, and I'll reach back out to you. We offer everything from one-on-one coaching to workshops, parenting classes, all kinds of stuff. So I would love to chat with you about what your needs are. Anyway, thanks for joining us this week. Next week, we will see you.